At 0510 on the morning of November 20th, 1943, First Lieutenant William Deane Hawkins crouched in a Higgins boat 500 yards off the beach of Betio Island, watching the naval bombardment that was supposed to destroy every Japanese fortification on the tiny coral atoll, 29 years old, 5 feet 10 inches tall, 170 pounds of Texas grit, wrapped in Marine Corps green. The son of a railroad worker from El Paso, who had dropped out of school to support his family during the Depression, was about to lead the most dangerous assault of the Pacific War. The bombardment was spectacular. 16-inch shells from the battleships USS Maryland and USS Colorado slammed into the island every few seconds. Cruisers and destroyers added their fire. Aircraft from the carriers Essex and Bunker Hill dropped bombs and strafed Japanese positions. The noise was so overwhelming that men in the landing craft could feel their teeth vibrating. Smoke and flame obscured the island entirely. Betio Island was 2 miles long and 800 yards wide at its broadest point, smaller than the Pentagon parking lot. The Japanese had transformed it into the most heavily fortified position in the Pacific. Over 4,500 troops were dug into bunkers built from coconut logs and coral sand, covered with steel plates and reinforced concrete. Some positions had walls 8 feet thick. Admiral K.G. Shibasaki had boasted that 1,000,000 men could not take Betio in 100 years. Hawkins commanded the Scout Sniper Platoon of the 2nd Marine Division, 34 men trained for exactly this kind of mission. They would go in first. Before the main assault waves hit the beach, Hawkins and his scouts would land on a long wooden pier that jutted 500 yards out from the island's north shore. Their job was to clear the pier of Japanese defenders and secure it as a supply route for the troops following behind. It was a suicide mission. Everyone knew it. The pier would be swept by crossfire from machine gun positions on both sides. Japanese troops were dug in beneath the wooden structure itself. Any Marine who set foot on that pier would be visible to every defender on the island. Hawkins had volunteered anyway. The naval bombardment lifted at 0545. The aircraft pulled back. For a few minutes, silence fell over Betio. Then the Japanese emerged from their bunkers, shook off the debris, and manned their weapons. The bombardment that was supposed to destroy them had barely scratched their defenses. The assault waves began moving toward the beach. Higgins boats carrying the first wave of Marines churned through the lagoon toward Betio's northern shore. Hawkins and his scouts were in the lead, heading for the pier that would either become a lifeline or a killing ground. Then everything went wrong. The tide was lower than anyone had predicted, much lower. The Higgins boats, which needed 4 feet of water to clear the reef, began scraping bottom 500 yards from shore. Engines roared as coxswains tried to push their craft over the coral. Some boats made it a few more yards before grinding to a halt. Others stuck fast immediately. The Marines had to get out and walk. Hawkins was among the first over the side. He dropped into water that came up to his chest, held his weapon above his head, and began wading toward the pier. Behind him, 3,000 Marines were climbing out of their boats and starting the longest walk of their lives. The Japanese opened fire. Machine gun bullets churned the water around the waiting Marines. Mortar rounds exploded in the shallows, throwing geysers of spray and shrapnel. Men who had been walking beside Hawkins suddenly disappeared, pulled beneath the surface by wounds or equipment, or the weight of death itself. The distance from the reef to the beach was 500 yards, half a mile of open water with no cover, no concealment, and Japanese gunners who had spent months registering their weapons on exactly this approach. Marines fell by the dozens, by the hundreds. The water turned pink with blood. Hawkins kept moving. He reached the pier and pulled himself onto the wooden structure. The planks were splintered from naval gunfire. Some sections had collapsed entirely. Beneath the pier, Japanese soldiers crouched in fighting positions carved into the coral, waiting to pick off Marines who tried to use the structure for cover. Hawkins did not wait for them. He dropped a grenade into the first position he found, then moved to the next. His scouts followed, spreading out along the pier, clearing the Japanese one position at a time. A machine gun opened up from a pillbox at the base of the pier, catching several Marines in the open. Hawkins sprinted toward the position, zigzagging across the exposed wooden planks, while bullets splintered the boards around his feet. He reached the pillbox, shoved his rifle through the firing slit, and emptied his magazine into the interior. The machine gun stopped firing. Within 30 minutes, Hawkins and his scouts had secured the pier. Marines from the assault waves could now use the structure to reach the beach without wading through the killing ground of the lagoon. But the battle for Betio was just beginning. The beach itself was a nightmare. The seawall that bordered the northern shore was 4 feet high, made of coconut logs, reinforced with coral. Marines who made it across the lagoon found themselves pinned against that wall, unable to advance, unable to retreat, taking fire from Japanese positions on both flanks. The assault was stalling. Commanders were dying. Communications had broken down. Nobody knew what was happening anywhere else on the island. The Marines on the beach were fragmented into small groups, fighting isolated battles with no coordination and dwindling ammunition. Hawkins refused to stay on the pier. His scouts had accomplished their mission, but Marines were dying on the beach. He gathered what was left of his platoon and pushed forward over the seawall into the interior of Betio. What he found was a landscape designed for killing. Every few yards, another pillbox. Every intersection, another machine gun. The Japanese had constructed their defenses in depth so that each position covered the approaches to the positions behind it. Knocking out one bunker simply exposed you to fire from the next. Standard Marine tactics called for combined arms assaults. Infantry would suppress a position with rifle fire, while engineers brought up demolition charges or flamethrowers. Tanks would provide direct fire support. Artillery would soften targets before the infantry advanced. None of that was available. The tanks were stuck on the reef. The artillery was still on the ships. The engineers were scattered across the beach, many of them dead or wounded. Hawkins had rifles, grenades, and whatever his scouts could carry. He attacked anyway. The first pillbox was 20 yards inland from the seawall. Japanese machine guns inside swept the area where Marines were trying to advance. Hawkins crawled through a drainage ditch until he was within grenade range, then lobbed 2 grenades through the firing slit. The explosions silenced the position temporarily. He was on his feet before the smoke cleared, rushing the bunker with his rifle, firing through the entrance to kill any survivors. One pillbox down, he moved to the next. This one was larger, built into an artificial mound of coral sand with firing slits covering 3 directions. Hawkins circled around to the blind side, climbed onto the roof, and dropped grenades through a ventilation shaft. When he jumped down, a Japanese soldier emerged from the entrance. Hawkins killed him with his bayonet. 2 pillboxes down, a machine gun opened up from 50 yards away, catching one of his scouts in the chest. The man went down hard. Hawkins was already moving toward the position, using shell craters for cover, working his way forward while bullets cracked overhead. He was hit for the first time at 0800. A rifle round caught him in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into a crater. The wound was serious. Blood soaked through his uniform. A corpsman tried to reach him, but Japanese fire kept everyone pinned. Hawkins bandaged himself and kept fighting. By noon on November 20th, Hawkins had personally destroyed 5 Japanese pillboxes. He had been wounded twice more, once in the leg and once in the arm. His uniform was torn and blood-stained. His ammunition was running low. Half of his original platoon was dead or wounded. The battle for Betio was supposed to take 3 hours. Intelligence had predicted that the naval bombardment would destroy the Japanese defenses, and the Marines would simply walk ashore. 12 hours into the assault, the outcome was still uncertain. The Marines had established a beachhead roughly 250 yards deep and 300 yards wide. They held a strip of sand and coral against an enemy who occupied fortified positions on 3 sides. Every attempt to expand the perimeter ran into interlocking fields of fire. Every position the Marines captured cost casualties they could not afford. Ammunition was critical. The Japanese had destroyed most of the supply boats crossing the lagoon. What reached the beach had to be distributed by hand, carried from the pier to the front lines under constant fire. Some units were down to their last few rounds. Hawkins organized his remaining scouts into ammunition-carrying parties. They made trip after trip from the pier to the front lines, crawling over bodies, ducking through crossfire, delivering the bullets and grenades that kept the beachhead alive. Then he went back to killing pillboxes. The night of November 20th was the longest of William Hawkins' life. Japanese troops launched counterattacks throughout the darkness, probing the marine perimeter, testing for weak points. Hawkins moved constantly along the line, reinforcing threatened positions, directing fire, helping wounded men to cover. At one point, a Japanese squad broke through a gap in the marine lines and threatened to roll up an entire section of the perimeter. Hawkins gathered a handful of scouts and led a countercharge that stopped the breakthrough and pushed the Japanese back. In the confused fighting, he killed 3 enemy soldiers with his pistol. Dawn on November 21st found Hawkins still alive, still fighting, still bleeding from wounds that should have sent him to an aid station. He had been in continuous combat for over 24 hours. He had personally destroyed or helped destroy more than a dozen enemy positions. He had saved countless Marine lives through his leadership and his refusal to quit. But Betio was not yet secure. Hundreds of Japanese defenders still held fortified positions in the eastern end of the island. The Marines would have to root them out, one bunker at a time. Hawkins volunteered to lead the assault. William Deane Hawkins was born on April 19, 1914, in Fort Scott, Kansas. His father, Charles Hawkins, worked for the Missouri Pacific Railroad, following the tracks from town to town as the company needed him. His mother, Elsie, raised William and his siblings in a series of rented houses across Kansas and Texas. The family was poor, not desperate, grinding poverty, but the kind of constant financial anxiety that shaped every decision. There was always food on the table, but never quite enough. There were always clothes to wear, but never anything new. William learned early that everything in life had to be earned, that nothing would be given to him, that hard work was the only currency that mattered. The family eventually settled in El Paso, Texas, where Charles found steady work with the railroad. William attended El Paso High School and excelled in athletics, particularly football and wrestling. He was strong for his age, quick on his feet, and absolutely unwilling to back down from any challenge. The Depression hit the Hawkins family hard. Charles lost his railroad job in 1932 when companies slashed their workforces. William was 17 years old, a junior in high school, suddenly the only employable member of his household. He dropped out of school and went to work. For the next several years, Hawkins worked whatever jobs he could find: construction labor, farm work, warehouse loading. He sent most of his earnings home to support his family and kept just enough to survive. The experience taught him things that no classroom could: how to endure, how to push through exhaustion, how to find strength when every muscle was screaming to quit. He eventually returned to school and earned his diploma. In 1937, he enrolled at the Texas College of Mines, now the University of Texas at El Paso. He studied engineering and played on the college football team, distinguishing himself as a tough, aggressive player who hit harder than his size suggested. College gave him something his childhood had not: time to think about the future. He watched the news from Europe with growing concern. Hitler was swallowing countries. Japan was conquering China. The world was sliding toward a war that seemed increasingly inevitable. In 1939, Hawkins made a decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. The Marines were not an obvious choice. The Army was larger and offered more opportunities for advancement. The Navy provided technical training and relatively safe duty. But the Marines had something the other services lacked: a reputation for being the toughest, most aggressive fighting force in the American military. Hawkins wanted to be the best. The Marines would make him prove it. Boot camp at San Diego stripped away everything that did not matter and built something hard in its place. Hawkins thrived. The physical training that broke other recruits barely challenged a young man who had spent years doing manual labor. The discipline that crushed independent spirits refined his natural leadership ability. The weapons training revealed a talent for combat that he had never known he possessed. He was promoted to corporal after boot camp, then to sergeant within his first year. His evaluations consistently noted his leadership potential, his physical courage, and his willingness to take on any task, no matter how difficult. When war came on December 7th, 1941, Hawkins was ready. He had been training for this moment for 2 years. Everything that followed, every mission, every battle, every wound, was simply the fulfillment of a promise he had made to himself in a recruiting office in El Paso. The Marines would have their war. Hawkins would have his chance to prove what he could do. The Pacific War in late 1943 had reached a turning point. American forces had stopped the Japanese advance at Midway and Guadalcanal. Now they were pushing back, island hopping across the Pacific, toward Japan itself. Each island brought them closer to the enemy homeland. Each island cost blood. Tarawa was part of the Gilbert Islands chain, a collection of coral atolls that the Japanese had occupied early in the war. The islands had strategic value as unsinkable aircraft carriers, platforms from which Japanese planes could threaten American supply lines. Taking them would open the road to the Marshall Islands and beyond. The assault on Tarawa was the first major opposed amphibious landing of the Central Pacific Campaign. Previous landings, at Guadalcanal and elsewhere, had faced relatively light initial opposition. The Japanese had contested those islands through months of grinding combat after the landings. Tarawa would be different. The Japanese had decided to stop the Americans at the waterline. Every Marine who tried to cross that beach would face the full fury of a prepared defense. Admiral Shibasaki had constructed his fortifications with German engineering principles and Japanese determination. The pillboxes were built to withstand anything short of a direct hit from a heavy naval shell. Underground bunkers connected the surface positions, allowing defenders to reinforce threatened points without exposure. Fields of fire overlapped, so that attacking any position meant exposing yourself to fire from several others. The garrison included 2,600 Special Naval Landing Force troops, Japan's equivalent of Marines. These were elite soldiers, trained for exactly this kind of defense. Another 2,000 construction workers and support personnel had been armed and would fight as infantry. They had enough ammunition for a prolonged battle and enough rice for months. American planners knew the assault would be costly. They did not know it would nearly fail. The critical miscalculation was the tide. Naval intelligence predicted that the assault would coincide with a relatively high tide that would allow the landing craft to cross the reef and reach the beach. They were wrong. The tide was a neap tide, lower than normal, and the Higgins boats grounded on the reef hundreds of yards from shore. The Marines had practiced for opposed landings. They had trained for beach assaults under fire. They had not trained for wading half a mile through chest-deep water while enemy machine guns scythed through their ranks. The casualties in the first 2 hours were catastrophic. Entire units were wiped out crossing the lagoon. Officers were killed before they could give orders. Radio equipment was destroyed by water and shrapnel. The assault plan, so carefully rehearsed, disintegrated on contact with the enemy. What saved the landing was individual courage. Marines who had no orders and no idea what was happening continued to push forward. Sergeants took command of leaderless platoons. Corporals organized scattered survivors into fighting units. And a handful of men like William Hawkins attacked the Japanese positions that were slaughtering their comrades. By nightfall on November 20th, the Marines had a toehold on Betio. They held the pier, a section of the northern beach, and nothing else. The Japanese still controlled most of the island. The outcome of the battle hung in the balance. Reinforcements arrived on November 21st. Fresh battalions landed on the western end of the island, meeting lighter opposition than the first waves had faced. Tanks finally made it across the reef, their 75mm guns providing the direct fire support the infantry desperately needed. Artillery was established on a neighboring island, able to fire on Japanese positions without hitting the American lines. The battle was turning, but the hardest fighting was still ahead. The eastern end of Betio remained in Japanese hands. Hundreds of defenders occupied fortified positions that commanded the approaches from every direction. The Marines would have to clear each position individually, taking casualties with every advance. Hawkins led the attack that morning. His original scout sniper platoon had been reduced to a handful of survivors. He gathered reinforcements from other units, Marines who had lost their own officers and were looking for someone to follow. They saw Hawkins, bloodied, but still fighting, and they followed him. The first objective was a complex of pillboxes that blocked the advance along the airstrip. Japanese machine guns in those positions had killed a dozen Marines already. Standard tactics would require hours to reduce them. Hawkins did not have hours. He led his men in a frontal assault, crossing 100 yards of open ground while machine guns swept the area. Marines fell on both sides of him. He kept running. He reached the first pillbox and threw grenades through every opening he could find. The explosions silenced the guns inside. He moved to the next position without waiting for his men to catch up. This pillbox was larger, more heavily fortified. Hawkins circled it, looking for a weak point, and found a ventilation shaft barely large enough for a grenade. He pulled the pin, counted, and dropped the explosive into the opening. The blast blew the entrance off the pillbox. Hawkins charged through before the smoke cleared, firing his rifle from the hip, killing the dazed survivors. His men caught up with him as he emerged from the bunker. They stared at the destruction he had caused. In the space of minutes, Hawkins had neutralized positions that should have taken hours to reduce. "More ahead," Hawkins said. "Let's go." They continued down the airstrip, attacking every position they encountered. Hawkins was everywhere, directing fire, throwing grenades, leading the charges that broke through Japanese defenses. He seemed invulnerable. Bullets that should have killed him missed by inches. Explosions that should have torn him apart left him standing. He was not invulnerable. He was simply too focused on the mission to notice his wounds. By mid-morning, Hawkins had been hit at least 5 times. His left arm hung useless, shattered by a rifle round. Blood seeped from wounds in his leg and chest. A corpsman begged him to stop, to let himself be evacuated, to give someone else a chance to lead. Hawkins refused. "There are still Japs on this island," he said. "I'm not leaving until they're gone." He led another assault at 1,100. This time, the target was a fortified position that had been holding up the advance of an entire battalion. Japanese defenders inside had repulsed 2 previous attacks, killing or wounding 30 Marines. Hawkins studied the position from a shell crater 50 yards away. The bunker was built into a rise of ground, with firing slits covering every approach. A direct assault would be suicide. But there was a dead zone directly in front of the bunker, a strip of ground that the machine guns could not depress to cover. If he could reach that dead zone, he could get close enough to use grenades. Hawkins explained his plan to the Marines around him. He would go first. They would provide covering fire, keeping the Japanese gunners suppressed while he crossed the open ground. Once he reached the dead zone, he would signal for them to follow. Nobody argued. They had seen what Hawkins could do. He broke from cover at a dead run. Behind him, 24 rifles opened up on the bunker, pouring fire into every visible opening. Japanese gunners ducked, unable to aim while bullets cracked through their firing slits. Hawkins covered 30 yards before the Japanese recovered. Machine guns swung toward him. Bullets kicked up dust around his feet. He was hit again, somewhere in the torso, but he kept running. Ask. 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 Dusk. Ask. 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 40 yards. 50. He threw himself into the dead zone, rolling to absorb the impact, coming up with a grenade already in his hand. He pulled the pin and threw in one smooth motion. The grenade sailed through a firing slit and exploded inside. The machine gun stopped. Hawkins was pulling another grenade when the Japanese fired a mortar round. The shell landed 3 feet away. The explosion threw him 10 feet through the air. He landed on his back, his uniform shredded, his body torn by shrapnel. For a long moment, he did not move. Then, impossibly, he tried to stand. His legs would not support him. Blood poured from wounds he could not count. His vision was fading. But he could still hear gunfire. He could still hear Marines dying. He reached for his rifle. The corpsman reached him first. William Deane Hawkins died in the arms of a Navy medical officer on the afternoon of November 21st, 1943. He was 29 years old. He had been in continuous combat for over 30 hours. He had been wounded at least 7 times. He had personally destroyed or helped destroy more than 20 Japanese positions. He had refused to stop fighting until his body simply gave out. The battle for Betio ended on November 23rd, 1943. Of the 4,500 Japanese defenders, only 17 were taken alive, and most of those were Korean laborers rather than combat troops. The Japanese garrison had fought to the last man, exactly as they had promised. The Marines paid a terrible price for their victory. Over 1,000 Americans were killed in action during the 3-day battle. Another 2,000 were wounded. The casualty rate exceeded 30%, making Tarawa one of the bloodiest engagements in Marine Corps history. The nation was shocked. Newsreel footage of bodies floating in the lagoon and stacked on the beach provoked outrage and grief across America. Critics demanded to know why so many men had died for a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific. The answer was that Tarawa taught lessons that would save lives in every subsequent amphibious assault. The Navy developed new landing craft that could cross coral reefs. Bombardment tactics were revised to actually destroy enemy fortifications rather than merely shake them. Communications equipment was waterproofed. Medical evacuation procedures were improved. Every invasion that followed, from the Marshall Islands to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, benefited from what was learned at Tarawa. The men who died on Betio did not die in vain. Their sacrifice improved the tactics and equipment that would carry other Marines to victory. But the lessons learned could not bring back the dead. William Deane Hawkins was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on Betio. The citation described his achievements in the formal language that military bureaucracy uses to capture courage. First Lieutenant Hawkins, in command of a scout sniper platoon, led the assault on the pier at Tarawa in the face of intense enemy fire, personally destroying numerous Japanese pillboxes with grenades and demolitions. Despite being wounded multiple times, he continued to lead his men in the attack, neutralizing machine gun positions that were holding up the advance of larger units. His extraordinary heroism and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service. The words were accurate but inadequate. They described what Hawkins did but not what it meant. A Marine who fought beside Hawkins at Tarawa provided a better summary. He was the bravest man I ever saw. Every time we got pinned down, Hawk was the one who got up and did something about it. He didn't wait for orders. He didn't ask for volunteers. He just went. And we followed him because we knew he would never ask us to do anything he wouldn't do himself. The Marines named the airfield on Betio after him. Hawkins Field served as an American air base for the remainder of the war. Planes taking off from the runway that Hawkins had captured flew missions against Japanese positions across the Central Pacific. His body was returned to the United States and buried in El Paso, Texas, the city where he had grown up, where he had dropped out of school to support his family, where he had first walked into a Marine Corps recruiting station and asked to serve. The cemetery is quiet now. The graves stretch in orderly rows marked by simple headstones that record names and dates and branches of service. William Hawkins lies among them, one marker among thousands, distinguished only by the medal designation that follows his name. He would have wanted it that way. The Medal of Honor placed Hawkins in exclusive company. Fewer than 3,500 Americans have received the nation's highest military decoration since it was created during the Civil War. The requirements are specific. The recipient must have distinguished himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Hawkins exceeded those requirements by any measure. He had attacked fortified positions that entire platoons had failed to reduce. He had continued fighting through wounds that should have killed him. He had led from the front when leading from the front meant almost certain death, but the medal was posthumous. Hawkins never knew he would receive it. He died believing he was simply doing his job. The Hawkins family received the medal in 1944. His mother, Elsie, accepted it at a ceremony in Texas. She had already received the telegram every military mother dreaded. She had already buried her son. The medal was recognition of courage she had always known he possessed. His father, Charles, lived long enough to see the nation honor his son. The railroad worker who had struggled through the Depression, who had watched his boy drop out of school to support the family, who had seen that boy become a Marine officer, now saw him become a national hero. The family kept the medal in a place of honor. They did not display it publicly. They did not seek attention. They simply remembered a young man who had given everything for his country. The Scout Sniper platoon concept that Hawkins helped develop became a permanent part of Marine Corps doctrine. These small units of highly trained marksmen and observers provided commanders with eyes and ears ahead of the main force. They identified enemy positions, called in fire support, and eliminated high-value targets. Modern Marine Scout snipers trace their lineage directly to units like the one Hawkins commanded. The training is different now, incorporating decades of advances in tactics and technology. But the essential mission remains the same: go where others cannot, see what others cannot see, do what others cannot do. Every Scout sniper learns about William Hawkins. They learn about Tarawa. They learn what he did with grenades and a rifle against positions that had stopped entire battalions. They also learn how he died. The lesson is not that Marines should seek death, but that they should not let fear of death prevent them from accomplishing the mission. Hawkins was afraid. He had to be afraid. But he did not let fear stop him from doing what needed to be done. That is the legacy he left to the Marines who followed. The 2nd Marine Division, which Hawkins served and died with, continued fighting after Tarawa. They landed on Saipan in June 1944, on Tinian in July, on Okinawa in April 1945. Each landing was less costly than Tarawa, in part because of the lessons learned from that bloody assault. Veterans of Tarawa, who survived the war, carried their memories into civilian life. Some became teachers, sharing their experiences with students who had been children during the war. Some became writers, documenting what they had seen for future generations. Some never spoke of it at all, keeping their memories locked away where they could not hurt. The Association of Tarawa Veterans held reunions for decades after the war. Each year, fewer men attended. Each year, more seats sat empty. By the 1990s, the survivors could fit in a single hotel conference room. By the 2010s, they could fit at a single table. Now, they are nearly all gone. The men who waded through the blood-stained waters of Betio's lagoon have followed their comrades into history. Their stories survive only in books, in archives, in the memories of children and grandchildren who heard them speak of things they barely understood. William Hawkins has no living relatives who knew him. The family line that began in Fort Scott, Kansas, has scattered across America. His name appears on a headstone in El Paso, on a memorial at the Marine Corps War Memorial in Arlington, on lists of Medal of Honor recipients maintained by the Department of Defense. He exists now only in the historical record. The living, breathing man who dropped out of school to support his family, who played football at the Texas College of Mines, who fell in love with the Marine Corps and gave his life to it, survives only in documents and photographs and the fading memories of those who knew him. But the example he set endures. Every Marine who faces impossible odds remembers, whether they know his name or not, that men before them faced worse and did not flinch. Every officer who leads from the front draws on a tradition that includes William Hawkins charging a machine gun nest with grenades in his hands. Every scout sniper who goes forward alone into danger follows a path that Hawkins blazed on a coral atoll 80 years ago. Courage is not the absence of fear. Hawkins was afraid at Tarawa. He had to be afraid. He was not superhuman. He was a young man from Texas with a Depression-era education and a determination to prove himself. He felt fear like any man would feel facing machine guns and mortars and the near certainty of death. He chose to act anyway. That is what separates heroes from ordinary men. Not the absence of fear, but the decision to do what must be done despite the fear. Not the lack of understanding of the danger, but the willingness to face the danger because others depend on you. William Hawkins made that choice again and again on Betio. Every time he charged a pillbox, he chose. Every time he threw a grenade into a firing slit, he chose. Every time he refused evacuation despite his wounds, he chose. He chose until choosing was no longer possible. He fought until fighting was no longer possible. He lived until living was no longer possible. And then he died, 3 feet from a Japanese mortar round, on an island most Americans had never heard of, in a war that would continue for almost 2 more years. He was 29 years old. Betio Island is quiet now. The coconut palms have regrown. The fortifications have crumbled into coral rubble. The airfield that bears Hawkins' name is used for civilian flights connecting the Gilbert Islands to the outside world. Visitors can walk the beach where Marines died by the hundreds. The water is clear and blue, beautiful in the way that only Pacific Islands can be beautiful. It is hard to imagine this place as a killing ground, hard to picture the blood that once stained the sand, hard to hear the screams that once echoed across the lagoon. But the reminders are there if you look. Rusted landing craft still protrude from the reef where they grounded 80 years ago. Concrete bunkers still squat in the undergrowth, their walls pocked with bullet holes. Japanese artillery pieces still point toward approaches that no enemy will ever use again. And on the airfield, a simple marker identifies the ground as Hawkins Field, named for First Lieutenant William Deane Hawkins. Medal of Honor, killed in action, November 21st, 1943. The marker does not explain what he did. It does not describe the pillboxes he destroyed, the wounds he ignored, the men he inspired. It simply records a name and a date, leaving the rest to history. Perhaps that is appropriate. Hawkins never sought recognition. He never asked to be a hero. He simply did what the situation required, again and again, until he could do no more. The Marines who followed him did the same. They cleared the remaining Japanese positions on Betio. They secured the island for American use. They went on to fight in other battles, on other islands, in the long, bloody march toward Japan. Some of them survived the war. Some did not. All of them carried something of Hawkins with them, whether they knew it or not. The example he set, the courage he demonstrated, the refusal to quit that defined his final hours, became part of the Marine Corps spirit that would carry through every battle that followed. That is how heroes truly die. Not when their hearts stop beating, but when no one remembers what they did or why it mattered. William Hawkins' body lies in a Texas cemetery, but his spirit lives on every time a Marine chooses to act despite fear, to lead from the front, to do what must be done regardless of the cost. He would not have asked to be remembered this way. He would have said he was just doing his job. He would have pointed to the other Marines who fought and died on Betio, insisting that they deserved recognition too. But history has chosen to remember him specifically, one man among thousands, because his actions exemplified what all of them were willing to do. He became a symbol of something larger than himself, a representative of the courage that ordinary Americans discovered within themselves when their country needed them. That is William Deane Hawkins, a railroad worker's son from Kansas, a dropout who went back to school, a college football player who found his calling in the Marines, a scout sniper who led from the front, a wounded man who refused to stop fighting, a hero who died doing his job. He led the assault on the pier. He destroyed 20 pillboxes. He refused to stop until his body gave out. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is William Deane Hawkins.